each and every one of you. It's been a fantastic transatlantic media conversation. We've been so lucky to have all of you guys representing major news organizations in Canada, the UK, and the United States sharing your experiences. So thank you, Maliha, Amina, Shaheen, and Janella.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Sound
you
like
so
everybody. Thanks. Good talking to you.
Now
Thank
I'm
you,
going
everyone.
to move on to our next, which is hosted by our very own Imam Asim Hafiz, who is Imam to, well, I'm going to screw this up, but I'm going to try to get this right. You are the Director of Muslim Life at the Ministry of Defense, is that correct?
That's okay. I'll do it now. I'll give some more details on it later. You need to get to know me.
I'm going to hand over to Imam, who's going to introduce our next guest, and I'm very excited about this. So over to you, Imam Asim.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot for that, Mudassar. For those of you who don't know, I have friends in high places too. Tom is a good friend, and it's an absolute pleasure to have him on with us today, despite many of his other commitments. So thanks, Tom, for joining us today. I'd just like to spend a few moments introducing Tom, because I think he deserves that. Tom has a mammoth of a career and experience behind him. We spent time in Afghanistan together, so I guess we've been to war together. However, there's a difference. He spent 4 years of his life deployed in Afghanistan, and he did some amazing and incredible things out there, which very rightly earned him an MB in 2009. He also worked for the Foreign Office and helped set up the National Security Council for Afghanistan and the government in Helmand province, having learned to speak Pashto and Dari. Though I was unable to join his exceptional operational tour of Iraq, when the Iraq war broke in 2003, he was mobilized as an Arabic-speaking intelligence officer to serve with the Royal Marines. While there, he was responsible for the distribution of the new Iraqi dinar and spent 6 months distributing $4.5 billion worth of cash that went into Iraq. He was more than instrumental and a leading force in supporting the establishment of the Armed Forces Muslim Association, which is a support network for Muslim military personnel in the British Armed Forces, which with Tom's vision has now become more than just an inward-looking organization and is a great resource for the armed forces in doing engagement across the communities in the UK and overseas, building Britain's reputation. We also worked together at the Ministry of Defence in the last job that he had as a serving officer in the British Army in 2013, when he was the military assistant and principal advisor to the Chief of the Defence Staff, the professional head of the British Armed Forces. You would be interested to know that he read theology at Bristol and then studied for a master's at Cambridge in Islamics. Thank God it wasn't SOAS, Tom, which included learning Arabic in Yemen. Following that, he worked as a journalist in Beirut, as well as working for the British government in Morocco. So with that background, Afghanistan, Iraq, Beirut, Morocco, Yemen, you might just mistake him for an ordinary confused Muslim growing up in the UK in the 90s. Anyway, he has been a Conservative MP for Tunbridge, Edenbridge and Marling since 2015, and since 2017 he has been the elected chair of the UK's Foreign Affairs Select Committee. If you've read Tom's pieces and listened to his lectures, presentations and media interviews, you will know that he's not a man that holds back. He's happy to call a spade and doesn't beat around the bush. So Tom is with us for 45 minutes and he will be talking to us today about the impact of COVID-19 on UK's foreign policy now and in the future as we recover from the crisis, having just left the EU with many unanswered questions. So Tom, over to you. Thank you very much again for joining us.
Friends. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh wa Ramadan Kareem. It's a huge pleasure to be here. I must start off by saying, as ever, Imam Asim is far too generous and really has been a very, very dear friend of mine now for more than 10 years, and every day has been a blessing. So I'm touched that you've invited me to speak today. What I propose to do is to talk for about 10 minutes about how I'm seeing the world, and then perhaps, if it's all right with you, to open it up to a discussion, because I think having that conversation will be more useful than me bumping my gums and giving to a one-sided argument. So I'd be very keen to hear other people's perspective. Clearly, COVID-19 has asked a lot of every country around the world. It's challenged ideas of nationality, of accountability. It's challenged ideas of privacy and of duties of one to each other. And this really does raise huge questions, not just for Western countries like ours, but actually for countries that have traditionally not been able to provide very effectively. So there are some countries, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa that have traditionally not been able to provide very effectively for their communities that are now being expected to provide in different ways. And then in other parts of the world, there are different forms of accountability that have been challenged. Now, we've heard, for example, quite extraordinary comments coming from the President of France recently, calling into question the solidarity of the European Union and Germany's role in that. We've heard comments from leaders in Italy questioning as well the role of an organization that up until really only a few years ago, a few months ago in some cases, was absolutely integral to the life of the nation. So we're seeing very real changes. But the most obvious, I suppose, the greatest change is exposing the relationship that we've long had with China. And I'm sure when I speak to this audience, it will come as no surprise that I'm going to say that it's exposing, it's not changing. Because actually our relationship to China has always been very difficult. Of course, we've had a dependence in terms of provision of goods and supply chains. And of course, we've also had a dependence in terms of the ability of financing of debt projects, whether that's huge industrial projects in the UK, or indeed in terms of financing projects in the developing world, where China has been a very prolific supporter. But those actions have always come at a price. And one of those prices has been human rights, and a lot of focus has quite rightly gone into the crushing of the democracy movements in Hong Kong. But a lot more, I've always argued, should also go into Western China, where in Xinjiang we're seeing over a million Muslims, by and large Uyghur Muslims, being re-educated, to use that rather horrible euphemism, which is actually a form of detention and punishment. Those moments of pressure that we're seeing inside China have been going on for a very long time. But because of this crisis, because of the silence that we saw in Wuhan, because of the impact that had on the spread of this virus and the consequent closure of the economy, people are now more aware of the impact of allowing a totalitarian state like China to have such great influence. And I think there is a greater awareness because of that, of the plight of the Uyghur Muslims, or indeed the Hong Kong demonstrators. And I think this is where I'd like to begin, really talking about how we should be thinking about changing UK foreign policy. Because the two challenges that we've now got are, how do we act internationally in an era where national accountability is growing, because it is the nation state that has been asked to protect the citizen, both in terms of health and public emergency. How do we deal with that internationalism, and how do we deal with the need to recognize that nationalism will not replace the need to cooperate in terms of climate change or in terms of human rights violations or whatever they happen to be? Because actually the fundamental interconnectedness, the ummah, if you like, the ummah of people, not just of a faith, is really a question, I think, that we've got to ask ourselves. And this is where I think that faith groups play a very important part, but actually so do wider international organizations. And I think the UK could be really instrumental here. One of the things that I would argue that Imam Asim has demonstrated very powerfully, and others have too, by the way, but Imam Asim has demonstrated very powerfully, is that one of the great strengths of the UK is that we are by and large pretty good at making sure that the British people can speak for all of us and with all of us across communities. Now, Imam Asim does it very obviously, others do it more subtly, but there are many people in our country who are able to reach around the world in a very powerful way. And I think that puts the UK in a very particular position. I think it allows us to be aware that our country is networked in a way that many are less so. And that creates dependence around the world, but it also creates influence around the world. And I think this is where we really need to be looking for our future post-COVID, strategies. Because the reality is that the world is going to be more interconnected. We are going to have to face up to the reality that we do depend on each other more. But that does also mean that we need to recognize that each other's values also matter. If we respect citizens, if we respect each other, then we are less likely to find ourselves in positions where scientists are forced to lie or where diseases are allowed to spread unchecked because the state is too afraid of the confession that actually it's not able to defend itself or rather defend its citizens in the way that they would expect. So I think we're finding ourselves now in a very interesting, if I may use the word loosely, a very interesting world where both the challenges of localism and internationalism feed into themselves or feed into each other. Now, the question, of course, of faith groups is always interesting because faith groups have traditionally been much better at internationalism than the national identity. And it'd be interesting to hear from people here various questions that I still have that I still cannot answer, but I'd be interested in perspectives. Many Muslims in the United Kingdom have been very clear in calling out the abuse of their brothers and sisters in Xinjiang, and the courage of the Islamic community in the UK is without question on this. But that's not replicated around the Middle East. There are many Muslim countries, Pakistan is an obvious one, which have been almost silent on the plight of Uyghur Muslims in China. Now, for Pakistan, it's pretty obvious why that is. It's dependence on China that causes the leadership to be muted on the But why is it so in so many areas of North Africa, for example? Why is it so in so many places of the Middle East? They're not as dependent. They could have a separate voice, and yet they choose not to. And I think this is a question where we need to ask ourselves, what role can we have as Brits perhaps of the Muslim faith and Brits of not of Middle Eastern origin, in making sure that we are able to be not just a vehicle for our own interests in the narrower sense as Britain's place in the world, but also of those human rights cases where we really do think that we have a case to make. So if I leave it there, I'd be very interested in having this conversation go further.
Thank you very much, Tom, for getting us started on this topic of Britain's foreign policy post-COVID. Can I start by asking, whilst people prepare their questions too, about whether, in hindsight, with this crisis now, that leaving the EU was a mistake?
Well, Imam, you know how I voted, but I don't think you can rerun polls like this. I've always believed,
like, would we have been better equipped as an individual country to deal with this crisis, being in the EU, and how we'll fare afterwards, or are we better or we'll fare less out of the EU?
I think it's impossible to answer the question because we just don't know. What we do know is that since the UK left, since the UK ceased to have influence in the European Union when we voted to leave, because in fact our influence started to diminish from the moment we voted to leave, even before we actually left a few months ago. The European Union has changed, and the European Union, as it exists today, is under very severe pressure. Now, some of that is not fair, bluntly, because the European Union has never argued in favour of, it's never been a single entity for healthcare, and it's never had that responsibility. That's always been a national responsibility. So it's, in some ways, it's unfair to comment on sort of the European Union's failure in health provision when the member states never gave it that responsibility. So it's not exactly a legitimate criticism. And yet the fact that it hasn't been able to provide something that it was never asked to provide has still been held against it by many citizens. So it may not be fair, but it is certainly the way it is seen. And that's something that we're seeing in Italy, and we're seeing it in France as well, and to the extent that even the president, in an interview recently with the Financial Times, came up. So I think it's really interesting to see that, you know, you can of course make a case that, you know, future cooperation would be easier if we were in the European Union. You can also make a case to say that the reality is that the European Union is really struggling at the moment, and we're better off charting our own future. And I think, I mean, my view has always been, if there's a table, Britain should sit at it. but that's a different argument to the one now. And I certainly don't think that it's worth going through the whole in-out argument again. I think the best thing to do is for us to move on.
Fabulous. Thank you very much for that. We've had quite a few questions coming in. Said Khan is saying, thank you for your insightful remarks. Do you think that Britain's recognition of its role in the colonial era and beyond, particularly those that have adversely impacted on the so-called Muslim world, will help it establish some better moral standing in asserting and reasserting its internationalist influence? Wow, bit of a mouthful, but I hope you get it.
I do, and I think, look, I have been. I think it's important for Britain to recognise its role, but I think it's also important, modern Britain, to recognise what we are. You know, I was with some guys recently, and we were talking about Jallianwala Bagh and the massacre of 101 years ago now, and I've been arguing that the UK should make a public apology. And it's one of these things. It's one of these things. The Foreign Office kind of says that we have done, and most people think that we haven't. It's one of those sort of. I think we could do it more clearly. But I was talking to a bunch of Brits about this in Parliament, and we would. One of them said reparations, and I said, okay, sure. I mean, I see your point. You know, Britain unquestionably behaved wrongly. I think it was unquestionably a crime. And I can see your argument for reparations. Reparations from whom and to whom? Because everybody in the room was British. They all happened to also be Sikhs from that area of India, and some of them were descendants of those who were killed. So where do the reparations go? Do they go from these Sikhs who are now British to those Sikhs who are still in India? It's not a particularly useful way of looking at it. I think what's a much more useful way of looking at it is looking at people who are British, you know, British today. And as Imam Asim, you and I are as British as each other. I mean, neither of us is more or less, right? In fact, you are a senior Brit to me because you're an officer of the Order of the British Empire, and I am only a member. So you are in all senses senior to me. But it's
always too kind. Always too kind.
It happens to be true. But so I'm not sure that it's useful to talk about it in that sense. But what I do think it's useful to do is for Britain to be honest, actually, and to look seriously at our past and to things that we got bluntly wrong, and we need to correct. You know, now, you know, there isn't much point in apologizing for the Crusades, I'm afraid. That happened so long ago. Oh, my son has decided to join us. Yes, you can watch something else. Yes. Yeah, you can get the iPad in the kitchen.
And I'm allowed to watch Super Wings?
Yes, you can watch Super Wings on the iPad.
The joys of being a parent, amazing.
Yeah, it's one of those days.
We haven't seen you do that on TV yet.
Yeah, I only just. I think what is important is to recognise that, you know, Britain is a product of, I'm afraid, you know, 2,000 years of history, like every other country, by the way, and is a product of several thousand years of history. Some of it's good and some of it's bad, and you know, it's very difficult now to, you know, to simply say this is bad and this is good. You know, there are real downsides to colonialism. I'm not going to argue in favor of them, but the fact that I'm sitting with a friend like Imam Asim means that there are some bits I just don't regret. I mean, the fact that Imam Asim is at home here, just as at home as I am, I think is a great wealth, actually, and a great legacy. Yes, of course, there are tragedies, and I'm not in any way belittling them, but there are also some benefits, and I hope to everyone.
You know, reading some of the articles that you put out recently, I do get a sense that you fear that these, you know, values and standards that we have, these principles that we have, that we champion, whether it's human rights, whether it's democracy, liberty, respect. You find that you mentioned that you feel that these values are at risk because you know, there are enterprises out there, businesses out there who may be turning a blind eye to what other states might be wanting to do in the UK, etc., etc. So, you know, what can you tell us about your worry about those values being at risk, at threat, just because people want to make some quick money? And also, you mentioned that potentially there are advisors, there are business people, potentially even ex-ministers that might be, you know, part of this process or problem. What can you? Because, you know, being a military man, you know the importance of values and standards, and you know how, you know, strongly we embed values and standards and principles into our military people. So I know where you're coming from, and I know the worry of taking our eyes off the ball in terms of values and principles and standards and ethics. So, and as, if I can add something else, you also talk about, you know, after the Second World War, there were a lot of people planning about what would happen post the war. So even though the war was going on, even though there was terrible times, we were busy planning to create a landscape, an environment where peace and stability would flourish. So, you know, we've got competing issues here. We've got the worry that our values potentially could be at threat and at risk because people want to make money and because other states have got malign interest in our country. But at the same time, we want people to be planning for a prosperous future post this crisis. How do you bring those things together?
So I think those are really important questions. And one of the concepts that we repeat a lot in the UK is Judeo-Christian values. And what we mean by that is the concept of equality and human dignity. And we use the term Judeo-Christian because we're broadly speaking a Judeo-Christian country, but actually I would argue that you could call them Islamic as well. It's not, the concept of equality.
Islam is also Judeo-Christian. Exactly
right. And the concept of equality before God, I think actually is much more Sunni and Protestant and Jewish than it is Catholic or Shia. But that's a theological point that I won't go into. But the very simple concept of equality before God without a priestly class, without an intermediate, is you know, it's the purest sense of Islam, right? I mean, it's the idea of the individuality of prayer and the individual relationship. And those concepts of human rights and human dignities that we get from faith, now whether we are people of faith, whether we're atheists or agnostic or whatever, they have come through our culture, and they are absolutely fundamental to our understanding of ourselves as people, I think, in a European context, and I would argue in most Islamic contexts as well. It's not universally true because some countries with very strong Islamic faith movements today don't have a very deep root of it, but that's not, the same is true, by the way, of some nominally Christian countries, of course. But the areas of the Middle East and Europe that are sort of from that traditional basin, I think, have a very strong and deep root of these values of individual dignity and human rights. And I think those are very important, because what they do is they set up an agenda into which you can fit, I think, the rules and ethics which work for a wider community. Now, one of the reasons I was so clear that we needed a Armed Forces Muslim Association is because too many people in the Islamic community in the UK were claiming that it was un-Islamic to be a British soldier. And I would argue very strongly the reverse, that actually it's entirely compatible. It's not even entirely compatible. It's absolutely in keeping with Islamic values to be a British soldier. When you look at the values and standards of the British Army and compare them to what the Imam has taught me, and many other people have taught me are Islamic values, I failed to see where the overlap doesn't match. Basically, the overlap is very strong. This is not an argument that Britain's foreign policy has always been right, or Britain's strategic decisions have always been right, but those are political arguments, not values arguments. And I think that what we're really talking about here is, how do we make those values really work in an international context? And the reason I've been critical of some people, and you may have seen it in last week's Mail on Sunday, I was quite critical of some people who are willing to sell us out, is that not recognizing the role of the community in defending the individual, and therefore the individual in supporting the community, is really to undermine the very country itself. And we see this in a much more immediate sense if we look at small family groups or small community groups, but actually the same applies more widely. We do have responsibilities to each other. The concept, I mean, I've used the concept of treason. We need to update the law on treason. And there are certain examples of this which are sort of scream out, but there are some more subtle examples where it doesn't mean that people need to go to prison for 1,000 years or be beheaded, but using the term correctly, that a betrayal is a betrayal, and that actually people do owe duties of care to each other and duties of responsibility to each other, is about inclusion as much as difference, if you see what I mean, because it actually defines, and I think very powerfully defines us all as having responsibilities one to another, which I don't think is a particularly wild concept, actually. I mean, I think it's a pretty fundamental concept to keeping a community, a nation, or indeed a wider ummah together, that we recognize our responsibilities one to each other.
I'd like to bring Mudassir in. Mudassir Ahmed, he's the head of the Concordia Forum. Concordia Forum is, as you know, as I mentioned to you, an international network of Muslim influencers and activists and important people. And Mudassir is the Concordia Forum is his brainchild. So Mudassir, you had a question.
Well, thanks. Thank you, Imam, and thank you, Tom. This has been very, very fascinating. I have so many questions, but there are loads of questions in the chat box as well, so I'm going to try to keep it very succinct. A couple of things. You mentioned about how faith networks can be potentially a source of influence abroad for nation states. I think that's fascinating. I don't know how much you know about the Concordia Forum, but we're in our 12th year now, and we're a very international European, North American network of senior media political types. And what's fascinating is that although we engage very heavily with the Muslim world, we have a relationship with the OIC, we've had several heads of state speak at our forums and that sort of thing, our intrinsic values as Western Muslims are actually quite different to what you might find amongst countries that are less secular, for instance, or are, deal with religion in a different way. Where I think the opportunity lies is a lot of these middle-class countries are sort of finding themselves in how they should interact with religion in a modern way. And funnily enough, they're looking at Western Muslims for answers in a way they're not looking at their own scholars for answers. So I do a lot of business in Malaysia, for instance. I go to Malaysia quite often. In Malaysia, the most popular Muslim scholars are Western Muslim scholars. Turkey, increasingly, the most popular Muslim scholars are Western. So they look at people like me and Imam Asim and others to give them religious moral guidance. And I think that how we can connect, how Western Muslims can connect with situations in the Islamic world is something I just want to leave you with as a thought. More of a point than a question, I suppose.
Well, I'm going to jump on that point and say I completely agree. And, you know, it's one of the things that I've always felt is a mistake, actually, is that we are not proud enough of our own religious education of Islamic scholars in the UK. I mean, actually, forgive me, his name has suddenly escaped me, and I had it on the tip of my tongue, who founded a Muslim college in West London about 20, 30 years ago.
Zaki Badawi.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Zaki Badawi, who is the most extraordinary scholar who taught in a very, I mean, in an English academic sense. I mean, his academic tradition was English, but he'd also come out of the Egyptian academic experience. And so he taught Islamic thought, and to me as a student of Islamic theology, he taught Islamic thought in a way that really opened it up. Now, he wasn't teaching me faith, because I'm practicing Roman Catholic, but the way he opened up the understanding of Islam was extremely powerful, and I thought was really informative. Now, even then, he was a major scholar, but what's really struck me is how we didn't value him at home as much as he was valued abroad. And I think this is something that we've got to correct. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why I've been so pleased that Imam Asim has been highly respected in the Ministry of Defence and in the government, because actually it demonstrates a changing attitude in the same way as we should be valuing, you know, bishops in the House of Lords, or, you know, cardinals in Westminster. You know, we should also be valuing chief rabbis, and we should also be, you know, valuing senior imams.
Thank you, Tom. Just follow up very quickly. I know there are loads of questions in the chat box.
Sorry, yeah.
Brilliant questions. But I just want to follow up very quickly. The Americans saw this opportunity, and they were very, very good at appointing special envoys to Muslim communities, a special envoy to the OIC, special envoys to deal with, you know, Muslim business. And many of these people are within the Concordia network. The Brits never followed up. I represent the OIC professionally, and our envoy to the OIC was always the Council General in Jeddah. I do feel that leveraging the British Muslim community post-Brexit in a more diplomatic sense could be beneficial to HMG.
Now, that I agree with. What I'm slightly cautious of, and this the Imam and I have spoken about a lot, and I think I'm right in saying that we still agree. So if you jump in and correct me if we don't, is that I've always been very clear that my role as Member of Parliament is to represent everybody in my community, and that there isn't a sort of a separate Muslim Member of Parliament or Jewish Member of Parliament or Christian Member of Parliament or whatever it happens to be, you know. And so I wouldn't want to see different representation within our own system. What I do see, your point though, is that, you know, using members of our own community here who are better at talking to other groups, you know. By the way, that may mean that the person who needs to be the envoy to the Vatican should not be a Roman Catholic, but should be an Anglican, because the faith of our land, you know, the official doctrine of our land is the Anglican community. Now, sending me as a Roman Catholic would be slightly misleading, because of course we're not a Catholic country. And so there may be aspects there where you look at who is the appropriate envoy, but sometimes that appropriate envoy will be the Catholic to, I don't know, the Catholic to Italy rather than the Catholic to Rome, if you see what I mean. And maybe that's a good point of saying that, you know, the Islamic community within the United Kingdom has various strengths, but we also should recognize that it's not one. You know, we have Muslims we have Muslims who are 20th generation English, and we have some Muslims who arrived yesterday from Sudan. So, you know, and the range within our community is huge. So it's not a single entity.
Thank you very much for that, Tom. There's a lot of questions, and a lot of compliments on the interesting remarks that you've been making so far. I'm going to couple 3 questions together. They're very different questions. The first one is, do you think that the military would have done a better job than the government in tackling COVID-19 in the UK had they been allowed to take charge early on? And I'm sure there'll be no biases there from you, being a full-time a member of the armed forces before and a reservist still now. So that's one about the military. The other one is congratulations on setting up the China Research Group. What role do you expect the CRG to play within the Conservative Party, and do you think the UK world will ever implement sanctions on China? So the CRG and sanctions on China. And number three, how much authority does the UN really have in changing the plight of oppressed people, in particular the Uyghur people? Did you get all of them? Do you want me to say them again?
No, that's fine. So the question of the military, look, nobody's prouder of our armed forces in all their many shapes and sizes than I am. We're really blessed to have some fantastic young men and women serving our country in uniform. But the armed forces have a role, and it's not quite the same as the state. And I think that the armed forces have been fantastic in responding to the call for help to help distribute protective equipment and to organise mobile testing stations and things like that. But the strategic oversight has to be from a democratically elected body. Forgive me, I think that is absolutely essential. That is the sole source of legitimacy in our country, and I'm glad that we respect that, and I'm very glad that the armed forces respond to that exactly as they should. And so I'm very proud of them, but I think that we all know that this really has to be led by scientists and by fantastic NHS professionals, not by generals. The China question is interesting. Look, the question here, and the reason I set up the CRG is because if you ask somebody who the President of the United States is, my guess is every member of Parliament will be able to answer that really easily. Who the US Secretary of State is, my guess is again, every UK parliamentarian would be able to answer that question pretty easily. If you got into details of European states, again, my guess is most British members of Parliament would be able to answer those questions. Go to China, ask them about who's the president of China, who's the foreign minister of China, what are the biggest companies, where did things come from? You start to get a much, much more fractured picture. And so we set up the CRG in order to basically collect information and share information so that people actually know what we're talking about. This is a hugely important relationship. There are good things about it, there are bad things about it, we know that, but we need to know what's going on. We need to actually read what's going on. And it's, I've spent quite a lot of time on the media of late, and I hope I haven't bored too many of you, but I've spent quite a lot of time on the media of late where I've said something and a journalist has said, well, that's your opinion. And I've said, no, it's not actually. President Xi said it in a speech 2 years ago. It's not my opinion, it's fact. And the journalist said, well, how do you know that? And I said, well, it's a public speech. He said it's a public speech. But the problem is because so few of us speak Mandarin, I don't, my Arabic even now is getting rusty, but because so few of us speak foreign languages here in the UK, there is a real problem of actually knowing what people have said. And actually the Chinese government hasn't really been secret about this. It really has said publicly most of the things that, we're saying now. But it's just that we haven't read it, we haven't listened, we haven't looked. And so the idea is to get the information out there and share it. And yes, starting off with Conservative members of Parliament, but actually, sharing it more widely too. And the question on the UN, look, the UN's got real problems because the UN, as you know, has 5 blocking members, of which we're one, and China is another. And international organizations that have blocking members find it very difficult to make condemnation of one of those members. I mean, it's just, for very obvious reasons. Look, and I don't want to see sanctions on China. Let's look really seriously at what China has given the world over the last few thousand years. We shouldn't be condemning the Chinese people or sanctioning the Chinese people. We've got to look very hard at what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a tyrannical regime of the nature that we see in many parts of the world. This one happens to be communist, but in other parts of the world, they're theocratic or they're fascist or they're whatever they are, or simply gangster. And the tragedy is that there are people in China who are being brutalized by a vicious and dictatorial state. And this is a tragedy for the world, not just for the people of China. And so what we've got to do is try and work to make sure that the engagement sees China open up. And in fact, that's what the policy of not just the British government, but most governments was up until a few years ago. We thought that greater engagement, greater trade, helping them join the World Trade Organization and things like that, would see China evolve and change into a more liberal, well, more open state, and perhaps move in a democratic direction. Now, sadly, that hasn't happened, and so now we've got to reevaluate.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I mean, staying on the topic of UN, we have seen China more recently being active at UN meetings and lobbying Islamic countries, particularly in Africa and the Middle East, where they have strong economic ties. Do you think that the COVID-19 crisis and the crashing of oil prices will force those countries, particularly in the Gulf, to rethink their economic relations with China?
Well, I hope it will, because actually I think, there are various things in the Gulf that I think have been, well, more of a mixed blessing than a blessing. Massive energy dependency has not promoted the kind of democracy that I think most people would like to see, and the increasing dependence on authoritarian states like China really doesn't help. So I hope that this will see countries in the Gulf doing what the good ones have already started doing, and that's diversifying their economy from petrochemicals into the wealth and ingenuity of their people. I mean, you just have to look at Islamic art, culture, and science over the last 2,000 years to know that people don't have to be, these could easily be centers of excellence, right? I mean, there's absolutely no scientific reason why the folk in these communities should be producing only one single item, and that's petrochemicals. I mean, they could be producing, the kind of innovations that would enrich the whole world, but instead it's been very limited. Now, I hope very much that these cultures will open up much more, and we already know that, as you rightly, we've spoken in the past. Countries like the United Arab Emirates have already demonstrated that it doesn't need to be the case, right? I mean, the Gulf states can be extremely innovative and creative.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm just going to have a quick look through. So, just one more question. Again, a lot of compliments for your excellent and very insightful thoughts. One question is, will the Conservative Party report their findings publicly once they have investigated the many cases of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hate?
Yeah, I hope so. Yes, I mean, I certainly think they should. I mean, I think, let's not pretend that any of our communities are perfect. Okay, I know that I hear in my own community, I hear anti-Semitism, I hear anti-Islamic hatred, I hear racism. These things come up, and it's all of us to call it out. And I know, Imam, that we've spoken about it. You've called out anti-Semitism in your own community as well, and you've called out other. These things are not limited to one group or one community, and all groups and all communities have responsibilities to call it out. And I don't think the Conservative Party is special in that, if you see what I mean. It's neither special in having it, and it's not special in having a responsibility to call it out. We've all got the same responsibility. So I hope that that will be made public, and I hope it will be. I hope it will be pushed hard. I mean, it's certainly, if you speak to, for example, the last chairman, James Cleverly, who started this going, it's quite clear that this is something we take very seriously. And the very fact, actually, that, Sajid Javid was, up until recently, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and was a very credible runner for leader of the party. He didn't win because, well, you all saw what happened, but he was a very credible potential leader for the Conservative Party. Shows that, like all groups, we have hateful minorities who, frankly, should just go away. But it's not an institutional thing. We have a strong representation of Muslim members of Parliament, and I think that's fantastic. Could we do with more? Of course, but you know.
Yeah. You know, I just feel that there's one threat after another, and when we come to the next threat, we feel that, oh, why didn't we see this threat coming? So, you know, we had international terrorism, Al-Qaeda, Daesh, and related terrorism and threats, you know, starting from the early 2000s. And then we realized while we were busy fighting international terrorism, Iran was upping, Russia was upping his game. And when we went to fight Russia, we realized actually we took our eye off China. So none of these threats have really gone away. They're either in the background or they're expressing themselves or in different ways, whether it's in the media or whether they put a suit and tie on and come and do business in our country. So how do you feel as someone who kind of is looking at Britain's relationship globally in its entirety? How do you think we're going to be able to manage all these threats going forward, particularly post-COVID?
So this is a real challenge because, you know, nobody knows the future but God. So frankly, asking me to predict the next threat is just impossible. And that's why I think I've got to do what you would do in an investment. You've got to look at spreading your risk. And the only way you can spread your risk in international affairs is to build up friendships and to make sure that you build up friendships and extend those friendships with people who share values, not just interests. So, you know, the relationship to the United States is not because we always love who's in the White House. That's blatantly not true. It's because the US people, by and large, believe in roughly the same things as the British people: the rule of law, international outlooks, you know, freedom of faith and religion, you know, all of these sort of pretty basic, I admit, but pretty basic aspects we broadly share. Now, we also happen to share them quite a lot in Europe, quite a lot in the Commonwealth, quite a lot in other parts. And by building up those networks, that patchwork of friendships based on similar allies, we make ourselves increasingly resilient to the shocks when they come, and they will come. You know, you're right, it was Al-Qaeda, it was a particularly virulent branch of terrorism. Now it's a pandemic. Tomorrow it'll be something else. I've no idea what it'll be, but it'll be things that individual countries find it really difficult to cope with. And the only way you get resilience is by having partnerships. I mean, it's not a secret, right? Teams work, and they work because by banding individuals together, you have greater resilience than you have as a single person. I mean, it's why families matter. It's why communities of faith matter. It's why ummah matters, because we're trying to create resilience amongst ourselves. And I think that's the right thing for nations to do as well, to build up partnerships.
I hope you don't mind if you can keep you on for another couple of minutes, or do you have?
Because it's you. Because it's you.
Thank you. I will come and have a cup of coffee with you again after.
As soon as we're out of lockdown, you better.
But talking about networks, there's obviously a different type of network that we're struggling with, and that's the 5G network. So, do you think that there's going to be a reversal in the Huawei 5G decision, or are we okay where we are?
I hope there will be. I mean, this is not going to surprise you, because it's the first time I voted against the government, or rather voted against my own party, was on this vote, because I think it's a mistake. It's not a mistake just because this will make it easier for people to spy on us. I mean, I'm not the computer expert, but somehow I suspect that if somebody really wants to break into my computer and they're clever, they can probably do it. Now, I couldn't do it to them, but they can probably do it to me. And I suspect these technical experts in places like Beijing and around the world won't be stopped by whoever's made the 5G mast. That's not the point. The point is that what we're doing when we buy major technological infrastructure like that is we are buying an understanding of a network and a perception of how business should be done that is then embedded into a system. In the same way as your values are written into your laws, in every word, in every concept, you're actually writing into law the values that you hold. The same is true of computer code. Computer code is written by human beings. I know it's noughts and ones, but it rests on assumptions that are actually value-based. Concepts of privacy, concepts of control, concepts of hierarchy are all human concepts that are then coded into systems. Now, we know that the Chinese government is trying to change this because they've actually made it, again, this is one of those moments where I say things and people say, how can you say that? Because they've made it plain, because they've actually said so at the International Telecoms Union. The Chinese representatives have said specifically they want to change the way the computers work together. Now, you know, the truth is that the current internet is based off a principle of individual rights and devolved networks that really is actually a very Western concept. Actually, I mean, it's a bunch of California hippies who have you know written into code. Well, actually, no, sorry, some of them are Brits have written into code some various concepts that we believe in as evolved systems of government, as democracies, as free states. And the Chinese government, and by the way, the Russian government as well, has made it plain that they want to change that. Now, I understand that authoritarian states would want to change that. That's kind of obvious. But I see no reason why we should pay them in order to allow them to have better strength in order to change that. I don't see why it's in our interest to do it. And so that's why I'm so against the Huawei decision. It's not a short-term thing, it's a long-term thing. It's about embedding values into the very networks of our society.
Fabulous. That's extremely interesting to be able to, I guess, link values and principles and ethics into cyberspace too, and how that impacts. You tweeted earlier today an article written by Tobias Elwood, and he talks about Westlessness, and that not restlessness but Westlessness. In other words, is the West really in the game? Is it really on the international stage now, or are we something of the past? And he spoke about needing new leadership, creative leadership, and creative policies, and that the West really needed it. And in particular, he calls out to Britain to step up and do what it does best, and that is to play an influence in the role for and be a force for good. But in the backdrop of this idea of Westlessness, how are we going to actually do that? It's a really good idea for Britain to step up, and I can't think of any other better country to do that with all the stuff that you mentioned at the beginning about our values and things that we've got to be proud of, but also our ability to admit when we do things wrong and to accept that we've done it wrong and we want to do better. How are we going to play that role? You also speak about leadership and initiative and this idea of being prepared for the aftermath. So what last comments could you give us about that, and give us some kind of hope and confidence that the people who are in the driving seat at the moment, the government, the people in government, are the right people to take us to the next stage? Well,
look, I think I have to say if I were in betting or if I were in investment, I'd be very, very long on the West, and I'd be very short on countries like China. And the reason I say that is because actually the thing that people say is our weakness, I think, is fundamentally our strength. The fact that we don't organize centrally and push people in a single direction, but actually instead, are a very diverse community that tries out things in very different ways and then settles on ways that work, means that actually we're much, much more robust than many others. So when you look at, for example, pandemics or falling oil prices or whatever it is, challenging the very underpinning of our society. And by the way, we know that this pandemic is not going to be over in a few weeks' time, but actually the effects are going to run and run in terms of economic costs and, you know, the need to rebuild the employment base of our countries and, you know, all those sort of things. That will put huge pressure on our community, and it will mean that we're going to be tested very, very hard in holding together. But actually, I think that what we've seen over the last few years is that our community does hold together very effectively. I think it does work well. And I think it's countries that are authoritarian, where the government fears the people, which is, if you like, one way of describing authoritarianism. It's any government where the government fears the people is an authoritarian government. And where you find that, actually there's a fundamental weakness there. So I think that the fact that, you know, groups like Concordia Forum are an important place of debate and thought demonstrates actually a depth of strength in the West that I think all governments can call upon. So look, I look forward to this easing and to our government reaching out to governments around the world, from, you know, obvious partners like the United States to countries like India and Pakistan and many others, and deepening the relationship so that we can actually really make sure that we are robust. And I see, you know, I know that many people sort of think about nation states and divisions, but I think actually nation states, like families, can become very useful building blocks. I think if you forget where you're from, it's very hard to work together with other people. I think having a strong family makes it much easier to be outward looking, and I think having a strong nation state makes it much easier to be an internationalist. I think when people sort of lose their way, it's when they don't know where they are at home. And I think one of the things that the UK is getting better at, I mean, nobody's perfect by any means, but the UK is getting better at is, you know, knowing who we are in all our diversity, in all our range, and being entirely comfortable with that. And I think that's one of the things that the UK can be very proud of, actually. And that's one of the things that allows us to be, I hope, good internationalists.
You spoke about authoritarianism and authoritarian regimes. We've got about 4 minutes to go, and before I bring Mudassar in to do any closing remarks, I just had one more question. What is our position on Iran at the moment, and the way that it's playing a pretty potentially a disruptive role in the Middle East, which impacts on our stability and security and the role that we play in the region. Is there a means of building stronger diplomatic relations with Iran? Is there more diplomacy that we can bring to bear to bring Iran into line and play a role within the international rules-based system?
Well, look, let's start off by being very clear that the biggest losers from the government of Iran's policies are the Iranian people. I mean, the Iranian people have suffered miserably under 40 years of tyranny, and before that under a different form of tyranny for far too long. This is a country and a culture that has given the world the most extraordinary gifts, from the game of chess to Shiraz wine. The range is really very, very great. And you know, if we look at the loss to humanity of having Iran cut off like this, you know, not just the loss to the Iranian people themselves, but to the whole of humanity of seeing Iran isolated, has been very, very great. I have to say, I think it's one of the great tragedies. And the reality is, I think what we need to do is we need to find a way of helping people to take control of their own destiny. The tragedy is we've tried many different ways in Iran, and frankly, none of them have worked. Because if you have an administration that really just doesn't care about the suffering of its people, your ability to leverage is very, very reduced, and we've discovered that they don't, and they're not willing to, act reasonably, frankly. You know, we're seeing hostage taking as a form of statecraft. You know, we focus quite understandably about Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe because she's a British woman. But actually, the number of hostages taken by Iran, numbers in the hundreds. Most of them are from neighboring Arab states, just by the way. There's a few from Italy, a few from France, a few from the United States, but most of them are from neighboring Arab states. And it's, it's an absolute tragedy. And when you look at what Iran spent the money that it was given from the deal, the Obama deal with the JCPOA, where did the money go? Did it go into roads or hospitals or helping the Iranian people? No, it went into killing Sunni Muslims in Syria. That's basically where it went. We know where the money went. It went into an extraordinary murderous regime under the Revolutionary Guard, and it's a complete tragedy that this country has been so poorly governed for 40 years. But we do need to find a way of working with Iran, because it is an absolute fundamental building block, not just of the Middle East, but of the whole world.
Tom, thank you very much for your precious time. I know you've got a lot of commitments. You've given us 15 minutes more than you said you would. I know you've got childcare responsibilities and family commitments.
So do you, Imam. So do you.
I appreciate that you're always very gracious towards me, so I appreciate that. And I'm not sure if Mudassar is there and whether he would like to make any final remarks.
Well, no, I just want to say, Tom, that was fascinating. Thank you so much. And I actually just want to say, I hope we can do this in person someday.
I'd love to.
With our group of people. I think it was a fascinating discussion. We can't, this medium is great, but it doesn't really allow for a full exchange of ideas. So hopefully we'll do that in person one day. Thank you so much. Thank you, Asim, and thank you, Tom. Much appreciated for that fascinating session. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in to the Concordia Zoom social distancing sessions that we've been running now for the past 8 weeks. Our next guest is Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib from Detroit, part of the squad. Doesn't need much of an introduction, but to give us more of an introduction and to engage in conversation with her, we have Baroness Saida Warsi, who is the former chair of the Conservative. Saida, are you here? Yes, you are. Fantastic. I'm going to hand over to Saida, who's going to chair our conversation. Rashida Tlaib, welcome both.